Battle of Sellasia coincides with a period of deep changes in the Spartan society, involving the ethical sphere and affecting the religious values, the culture, and the mentality as a whole. The 3rd century BC is often portrayed both in ancient sources and in modern literature as a period of decay and of crisis. As we can say here from Cleomenes by Plutarch, the citizen had been luded to sleep by idleness and pleasure. Okay, thank you. The king was willing to let all the public business go, provided that no one thwarted his desire for luxurious living in the middle of his wealth. The public interests were neglected, while every man was intent upon his own private gain. And as for practice in arms, self-restraint in the young, and hardiness and equality, it was even dangerous to speak of them now that Agis was dead and gone. The rich neglected the common interest for their own private pleasure and glorification. The common people, because of their poor state at home, had lost all readiness for war and all ambition to maintain the ancient Spartan discipline. Anyway, as we shall observe, the 3rd century BC is rather a phase of transition towards new behavioral and ideological models, entailing a series of transformations, ultimately resulting in the loss of the religious and territorial boundaries that once were defining the Spartan geopolitical influence over Laconia, over the Peloponnese, the weakening of the fear of divine punishment, and the change in the conception of impiety. The decline of some of the traditional local gods and the rise of new deities, the novel relevance of philosophy, remarkably of Stoicism, and the new conception of kingship and of state government, and also the unprecedented relevance of women in the state management. It is indeed an area of radical change, reaching its climax with the reforms implemented by King Cleomenes III, as we just saw with the previous speech, that included the redistribution of land, the creation of new citizens, and the reenactment of the lapsed public education system, the agogé. So we start with the loss of territorial and religious boundaries. The religious practices and institutions at Sparta, as elsewhere in the ancient Hellenic world, evolved in tandem with political and social change. As other ancient Greek communities, the Spartans created and corroborated their civic identity through the recognition of shared cults and the performance of periodical collective rituals that were aimed to strengthen the social bonds among the participants. Some of the Spartan sanctuaries were located inside the city, in the agora, in the Acropolis. Then we have other sacred areas that played a part in defining the borders of the city that was deprived of walls until the Hellenistic period. And then we have other sanctuaries that, with their extra-urban location, they acted as territorial markers, declaring the Spartan domination over the region. But in the aftermath of Leuctra, as the Arcadian-supported Theban forces expanded, several peripheral areas of the Spartan Chora that once hosted the above-mentioned sanctuaries began to spin out of Spartan control. As we said, the religious borders played a crucial role in stressing the territorial power and supremacy of Sparta, and the fact that these sacred liminal places were no longer in Spartan control had strong political and religious consequences. By conquering the Laconian territories that once were controlled by Sparta through its religious network, Epaminondas in fact wished to deprive the polis of the illusion of military and economic security. So the Theban forces deeply altered the political and sacred geography of the Peloponnese. Epaminondas invaded the valley of Messenia, recalled expatriate Messenians, and founded at the foot of Mount Itomi the polis of Messene, protected by fortified walls and where an important sanctuary of Zeus stood. One of the most important blows for Sparta in the 4th century, besides the defeat of Leuctra, was in fact the foundation of this independent polis in the territory of its formerly controlled neighborhood. Sparta did not only lose nearly half of her most fertile police-controlled territory, but gained a new threat on its western border. Not only did the Arcadians engage in an aggressive politics invading Laconia, but moreover, in the campaign of 369, the Thebans also contributed to the foundation of Megalopolis in the southwest Arcadian plain, a new city that would prove an effective and long-lasting opponent to the Spartan ambitions. So by 368 BC, Sparta had been deprived of something like half of her surrounding territory, including the most fertile soil and some strategically and symbolically sensitive sacred border markers. Another deep alteration of the Spartan system is connected to the progressive awakening of the fear of divine punishment and divine revenge, accompanied by the change in the perception of impiety. This unreligious behavior is widely reflected in the lack of respect for the sacred calendar, for the religious festivals, and for the sanctuaries. Previously, in the classical period, the Spartans were even more inclined to delay military action rather than postpone a festival or ignore a religious prescription. For instance, in 479 BC, the Spartans could not march out to fight Mardonius because they were celebrating the Iakintia, and they considered of utmost importance to prepare the things of the god. Later on, during a Spartan campaign against Corinth in 390 BC, King Agesilaus sent the soldiers from Amyclae home because the people of Amyclae, whether they are on a campaign or for any reason they are away from home, always return to celebrate the Iakintia. And it was perhaps the Carneia that kept the Spartans from arriving on time for the Battle of Marathon in 490, and this festival even prevented them from sending a larger force with Leonidas to the Thermopylae in 480. The Gymnopediae too could keep the Spartans from leaving the city. Thucydides reports that in 470 the Argive Democrats waited for the celebration of the Gymnopediae before attacking the oligarchs who were in power, and the Spartans delayed giving assistance to their allies at Argos for the same reason. Conversely, during the 4th and 3rd century BC, a series of unreligious actions, not compatible with the previous attitude towards religion, were in fact performed by the Spartans and also by the enemies of the Spartans as well, reflecting this gradual decline of the traditional conception of religion, of the sacred realms. Before the Battle of Leuctra in 382 BC, Sparta seized the Acropolis of Thebes, the Cadmeia. A Spartan garrison held the citadel for 3 years, and according to Xenophon, this was an illegal act of impiety for which Leuctra was the divine punishment. Therefore, according to Xenophon's explanation that is reflected in the view of the Spartans themselves, the catastrophic military defeat of the Spartans at the Battle of Leuctra was the gods' revenge against the Spartans as oath-breakers and wrongdoers. Later on, Sparta was involved in the outbreak of the Third Sacred War, adopting an ambiguous attitude towards the sanctuary of Delphi. Formerly, Sparta was an active member of the Delphican Fictiony and was deeply tied to the oracular sanctuary of Apollo, periodically consulted for any political and military matter. For instance, following the earthquake and the fire that had wrecked the temple of Apollo in 373, both individual Spartans and the Spartan state financed and administrated its reconstruction. Anyway, after the Battle of Leuctra, Thebes manipulated Amphictiony into fining Sparta an exorbitant 500 talents for its seizure of the Theban Acropolis, and in 356, again at the instigation of Thebes, the Amphiction even doubled the Spartan paid fine, and at the same time inflicted a penalty on Phokis for cultivating the sacred land. At this point, Sparta supported Phokis and contributed to provoke the Third Sacred War, which kept Thebes occupied and out of Peloponnesian affairs for over a decade. Archidamos, in fact, helped the Phocians, granting them the large sum of 15 talents given to the Phocian leader Philomelos. The latter used the money to assemble a mercenary force, seized the temple of Apollo at Delphi, and plundered the divine treasure. This action, besides proving the looseness in respecting the divine rules, anyway proved the Spartan capacity of planning wide political strategies. Archidamus, in fact, used the broader destruction of the sacred war to turn his attention to Megalopolis and Argos. In 241 BC, Agis IV returned to Sparta, where he found the community revolting against him and the once exiled Leonidas II back in kindly office. Agis IV claimed asylum in the sanctuary of Athena Chalkioikos, widely known as an inviolable place of asylum, to no avail. He was quickly tried and executed together with his mother and grandmother. Later on, Cleomenes III, who started his career by occupying the precinct of Athena at Belbina upon the orders of the Air Force, took the opportunity to seize Argos while the Achaeans were busy with the celebration of the Nemean Games. The shift towards a new, looser, and more relaxed vision of the religious duties did not apply just to Sparta, but also to its enemies. Aratus, the leader of the Achaean League and the conceiver of an ambitiously expansionist program that foresaw the unification of the Peloponnese under the Achaeans, offered sacrifices to a human being, to the Macedonian king Antigonus III Doson, with the view to stipulate with him an anti-Spartan alliance against Cleomenes III. Nor did the conception of impiety resist in the Aetolians that in 240 invaded Laconia and despoiled the sanctuary of Poseidon at Tainaron. The just mentioned change in the concept of impiety is accompanied by a decline in the worship of the Spartan traditional gods. First of all, the Dioscuri, besides supervising the education and training of the young citizen, symbolized the duality of the Spartan kingship. The two kings were entitled to carry images of the Dioscuri to the battles so that they could assist them in the battle, and the battle itself was preceded by a sacrifice offered to the divine brothers. But in this era, the cult of the two brothers gradually fell apart as a symbol of the two kings. Areus I, as we already saw in this morning, introduced a silver coinage bearing the name of one king only alongside the image of Heracles in preference to the image of the Dioscuri. And then also the sanctuary of the Poliadic Athena Chalkioikos was no longer regarded as a sacred place of refuge, given that Agis IV, as we said, looked for asylum in the sanctuary in vain. And later on, Cleomenes III declared himself a direct descendant of Heracles, whose figure gradually replaced that of Castor and Pollux in the exaltation of royal power. And so deep was the change in the conception of Spartan dual kingship that Cleomenes installed as his co-king his own brother Euclides, making it clear that the days of the ancestral Agiad Europontid diarchy were over. Anyway, given that Cleomenes III implemented his radical reforms under the guise of an apparent restoration of all tradition to make them acceptable to the community, he revived and manipulated the cult of Artemis Orthia. On the observe of a silver tetradrachm, he placed his own birdless visage in the manner of the Seleucids, while Artemis Orthia is depicted on the reverse of the coin. He also used some of the Egyptian financial aid granted by Ptolemy III to rebuild the temple of Artemis Orthia. And this was a smart move to advertise his restoration of the Agoge, many of whose religious manifestations were closely associated with the cult of Artemis Orthia. So even when the ancient cults were apparently resumed, the reasons were mainly political in nature. Furthermore, a series of sacred places and cults replaced the older, more traditional ones, gradually raising their profile and their importance. Besides Heracles substituting the Dioscuri in the political realm, the oracular authority of the Temenos of Ino Pasife at Telame acquired a greater relevance. So when Agis decided to send Leonidas away, he attributed this initiative not to the Delphic Apollo, but to the Ino Pasife oracle. Subsequently, during the reign of Cleomenes III, it's again the oracular sanctuary of Ino Pasife to predict in advance, through a dream, the removal through the killing of the efforts. It was in fact a common practice for the Spartan efforts to sleep in the shrine of Pasife in order to receive some prophetic dreams. More remarkably, one of the efforts, the only survivors of the carnage perpetrated by Cleomenes, found salvation in the temple of Phobos, the fear, thus underlying how the cult places of the pathemata, which are personification of abstract concepts and feelings, became safer than the older traditional sanctuaries, such as the one of Athena Chalkioikos. Besides the worship of the pathemata, the veneration of female heroines such as Helen and Cassandra Alexandra spread. For instance, in the Hellenistic period, in the sanctuary of Agamemnon and Cassandra Alexandra at Amyclae, the religious focus gradually shifted in favor of the female counterpart. By at least the early Hellenistic period, Cassandra assumed a more prominent role and was considered the main owner of the sanctuary. Rituals commemorating her death are recorded in the 2nd century BC honorary decree establishing a specific set of rites, the prostopa, to which the Spartan magistrate participated. And this ceremony included the theoxenia, the invocation to the Cassandra Alexandra, a sacrifice, and a banquet that was attended by the efforts. And the spread of her cult is testified also by Hellenistic marble throne with a dedicatory inscription. So, finally, in addition to the decay in the worship of Athena Chalkiokios, the decay in the worship of the Dioscuri, and the raising of the cult of Heracles, of Pasife, and of the pathemata, and of female heroines such as Cassandra, new divine figures were introduced in the Spartan pantheon, such as Serapis. Another novelty in the Spartan ethical and religious system is the increasing relevance of philosophy, which somehow took the place of the archaic rigid devotion to the religion, sacred rules, and divine calendars. Stoicism played a crucial role in the shaping of the personality of Cleomenes III, who studied its principles since an early age under the guidance of Sparus, that was a Stoic philosopher, one of the leading pupils of Zeno of Cyzicum. So we have this information in Plutarch. Cleomenes studied philosophy when he was still a teenager, after Sphereus of Borysthenes, who admired the manly natures of Cleomenes and increased his ambition. Sparus is also the author of a work on the Spartan constitution in 3 books, and in this regard, the 3rd century is marked by both the birth of a philosophical reflection on Spartan polity and the birth of a Spartan historiography, given that some time after 250 BC, Sparta produced in Sosibius its first homegrown antiquarian and local historian. Surely, the confidence with which Cleomenes implemented his apparently Lycurgan reform was influenced by the wisdom and erudition of Sparus. As we already said many times this morning and also yesterday, such a constitutional reorganization entailed the cancellation of the debts, the redistribution of the property, the expansion of the citizen body, and the restoration of the agogé, which had fallen into disuse sometimes in 270. Cleomenes' claim for a return to the ancient tradition allowed him to innovate under the guise of restoration. Sparus successfully managed to forge the Stoic personality and lifestyle of the young king, marked by self-control and contempt for luxury and opulence. His own manner of life was simple, plain, and no more pretentious than that of the common man. And it was a model of self-restraint for all. Even more stoic and at the same time stuck to the ancient religious tradition is the figure of the mother of Cleomenes, Cleia, who did not hesitate to turn herself as a hostage to Ptolemy III for the sake of Sparta, having still an intact and genuine faith in the gods, in the traditional Spartan gods. So when she was about to embark to go to Ptolemy III, she met her son in the sanctuary of Poseidon, and his son Cleomenes were crying, and she told him, "Let no one see us crying or doing anything unworthy of Sparta, for this lies in our power, and this alone. But as for the issues of fortune, we shall have what the god may grant." Nevertheless, Sphereus failed to teach Cleomenes that the detachment from life that would have allowed him to honorably die as a Spartan of the old times would have done in the Battle of Sellasia with his fellow citizens. The changes occurred in the 3rd century BC in the Spartan ethos were in fact so intense, so deep, that Cleomenes III did not hesitate to flee after the disastrous defeat of Sellasia, eventually escaping to the court of Ptolemy III at Alexandria. So in conclusion, Sparta entered the Hellenism with a deeply changed religious and ethical structure, which, instigated by external causes and primarily by the loss of the territorial religious boundaries in the Laconian region, resulted in a faded respect for the ancient religious tradition, sacred festivals and calendars, in a weakened fear of divine punishment for impious and religious action, in a progressive abandonment of the worship of ancient gods and cult places, in a new relevance of philosophical thought and political strategies, in some cases deprived of the original moral depth and sense of honor, but anyway coherent with the novel Hellenistic geopolitical situation in the Mediterranean area. Thank you.